But first, it's clear, isn't it, where the Victorian hotel quarantine inquiry is going. As Counsel Assisting's closing submission showed, the inquiry is looking to pin the blame on the bureaucrats. The same bureaucrats the Premier insists continue to have his full confidence. You see, you can tell what's coming, can't you? A report that lets the Premier off the hook so that the Premier can then let the officials off the hook. Of course, you'll throw a couple of them under the bus, like the official who reported to Jenny Makakos, given Makakos has already resigned. She needs a few other sacrificial lambs. He'll find them down the levels of the bureaucracies so that all the other officials at the top who are keeping his secrets with the lines of "I don't know" and "I can't remember," they get looked after, lest they start to tell us what really went on and who really is to blame. So the outcome? Well, it'll be that no one takes responsibility, that no one ends up accountable for the errors and the untruthfulness that's directly caused the deaths of 768 Victorians and counting. Almost certainly, based on the closing submissions, the inquiry will take at face value the Premier's testimony that he never knew military assistance was on offer, and won't contrast it with his public statement on March 27 that he knew about the PM's offer. He knew about it because, in fact, he welcomed it.
Premier, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping people?
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
Now, I say almost certainly because the former Health Minister issued a statement on the weekend strongly saying that she disagreed with the Premier's sworn statement to the inquiry on Friday. But neither Jenny Makakos nor Dan Andrews have been recalled to give further evidence. Now, that to me, legally, is troubling. That to me says the inquiry needs to better demonstrate it's after the truth here and isn't allowing itself to be a PR exercise for a government desperate to spin its way out of this mess, a mess of its own incompetence and its own making. Now, I know that Australians are suffering from COVID fatigue, especially here in Melbourne. I know it. I'm living through it. I'm living through the lockdowns with every Melburnian. And I know people will be inclined to say, now that we're starting to come out of things, the mistakes were inevitable when dealing with an unprecedented natural disaster of this global scale. And that's true, but only up to a point. Plainly, the New South Wales authorities badly bungled the Ruby Princess. But there was a full judicial inquiry in New South Wales that could compel witnesses and subpoena documents that reported swiftly. And New South Wales clearly learned from the mistakes. Victoria didn't, and it still hasn't. Back in April, it was clear that there were serious problems with the use of private bouncers to run hotel quarantine, but nothing was done about it until it was far too late. Remember, 850 military were sought, agreed to be sent to Victoria, and then knocked back by Victoria the next day. And as a consequence, almost 800 Victorians have died. Back in April, there were serious problems too with the way Cedar Meats, the abattoir, that outbreak was handled. It looked like a cover-up to me. They were slow, weren't they, to tell us the name of the company that was involved, its connections to a certain Labor MP, or indeed its past history as a Labor Party donor. It's been months and months of spin over substance, of the hard work not being done, of Victorians being blamed for not doing the right thing, demonised and fined when the mistakes were deep inside the Andrews government. And as we all know, a fish rots from the head. As anyone who's watched the Premier's media conferences these past months know, Daniel Andrews is over it. Especially over the past few weeks, the man at the podium no longer radiates the spin master's polish, but instead a testy impatience with everyone who thinks he might actually be to blame for this mess. Because deep down, even Andrews knows that's true. The buck has to stop somewhere, and plainly, that's with Daniel Andrews. I'm sure one of the reasons the Premier now says he's bringing forward the easing of restrictions to the middle of October, not the end of October, bringing it forward by a week. I reckon one of the primary motivations there is that he can then stop his daily press conferences and end what's clearly becoming a torture for him. Before, they were an hour and a half of free media marketing for a man who thinks he walks on water. Now he no longer has the compliant press pack he once had, and with over 750 Victorians dead and many businesses in ruins, too many uncomfortable questions are tripping him up. And the Daily Presser is now a growing political risk. So mark my words, his daily press conferences will end shortly. But so too will his time as Labor leader. My expectation is that Daniel Andrews will find a reason to step down early in the new year in the hope that Victorians will be so relieved to turn the page on 2020 and at the final easing of restrictions as we go into Christmas, that we'll end up thanking him for saving us, rather than rightly blaming him and his ministers and his bureaucrats for causing this second wave in the first place. The Premier's latest evasion is to point to the coming Federal Royal Commission into this whole corona crisis. But we know what will happen there, don't we? Victoria will welcome it, but then they'll reserve their right to withhold full cooperation, just as they did right to the wire with the Federal Bushfire Royal Commission. Meanwhile, someone has to take responsibility for the private security disaster. It cannot remain. A creeping assumption was the word Counsel used on Friday that came from no one or no individual, but somehow captured the whole government. Because just as the last bushfire season won't be the only one we ever face in Australia, this pandemic won't be the last one we suffer through either. There will be another pandemic. Maybe not for a decade or so, but assuredly one will come. And if we're going to do things better next time, we must understand fully what went wrong this time. I'm not going to let this rest, along with many others, until there is a full and transparent Royal Commission and Victorians learn the truth of how and why their government abandoned them at the cost of so many lives and livelihoods.